Well, I think not enough people know her story, Etty Hillesum's story. It is a most unusual story in the sense that she was not caught up in hating the Nazis like everybody else was, and as we would be if we were in that situation. That's a very normal reaction, but she was most unusual. I mean, for example, she says that when she was in Westerbork camp, she says, sometimes I stand in some corner of the camp, my eyes turn towards your heavens, O God, and tears sometimes run down my face, tears of deep emotion and gratitude. I mean, that coming from a person in a concentration camp is most unusual. And one night, she was taking a walk along by the barbed wire, and it was a clear sky. And instead of noticing those horrible towers, menacing towers with a guard on top of each tower with a machine gun, she looked up and she saw a full moon. And she thought, oh, how beautiful that moon is. She said, full of silver and eternity, like a plaything that fell from God's preoccupied hand. This is a person now in a concentration camp who's got these feelings, which is most unusual for World War II. Well, she grew up. She had a difficult childhood. Her family were well educated. Her father was a very well educated man, a schoolmaster, and I'm sure the conversation at dinner would have been very educated. But but her parents had a very stormy marriage. There was a lot of screaming, in the house at night, and that would often make her cry. She called it a madhouse. She said, my home growing up was a madhouse. She said it was an indescribable mixture of culture and barbarism. She's really she writes strong things about her parents. Her father was a very, very bookish man, very well educated, but a little impractical when it came to the ordinary things of life every day. And her mother also was very, very emotional. And so one has to say, she was unhappy growing up, as were her two brothers. They also had psychiatric problems. And she, experienced a lot of depression growing up. And then she got counseling therapy from a man called Julius Speer, a German who fled the Nazis in Germany and came to Holland. And he was the one that was instrumental in bringing order to her emotional chaos. He was an unusual, very unusual therapist, however, and unorthodox by today's standards, in the sense that he indulged in physical wrestling with his patients on the floor. And then actually they began a love relationship developed between them, between the therapist and the client, which is most would be unethical in today's standards for sure. But despite that, his counseling of her was very successful, and eventually she loved him, but she became much more detached and unselfish. And her love for him eventually became love for all humanity and ended up being her love for her own people. And she basically, in the end, gave her life for her people by going to Westerbork camp to help them, to be a counselor for them. She began to realize that you can't think yourself into heaven. You can't constantly intellectualize things. He was too inclined to intellectualize everything. And she began to realize that she needed to just be still and be comfortable with silence and and just listen to her inner voice. And she did feel God's presence within her. And then she began to kneel, which was most unusual for Jews. Jews don't have a tradition of kneeling when they pray, but she began to do this because she felt this need. She'd suddenly have this need to thank God and have this emotional feeling, and she would go down on her knees. And she would do it even in some embarrassing situations. At one point, she is with one of her lovers, and he suddenly stepped out of the room. And while he was out of the room, she suddenly felt this need to go down on her knees and thank God. And she did that. And then he came back in unexpectedly, and then she was embarrassed. She saw him, he saw her on the floor, and she made up an excuse. She said, "Oh, she says, I'm just looking for a button." And she got up. But in reality, she was just embarrassed to talk about the fact that she kneels. She said that kneeling is such a personal thing. It's as difficult to talk about as sex. And then she finally did bring it up with her therapist after struggling, and then found out that he, Julius Spear, also knelt. These are now Jews. And he also knelt when he prayed. It was he who introduced her to the St. Matthew's Gospel, to St. Paul's writings, and to St. Augustine. So they were both very assimilated Jews, and much of what she read was actually Christian and Catholic, her favorite authors. Well, I think it's a very inspiring story about a person who was very emotionally confused when she was younger and struggled. She was also promiscuous. She had two lovers at the same time. She was sexually active with two different people, both of them almost double her age, the therapist being one of them. And then she found peace and order to her emotional chaos, and then became profoundly spiritual. And in the end, I really believe that she was a mystic, although an unusual mystic, a mystic who became a mystic in the cauldron, in the crisis of World War II, not in the quiet peace of a convent. We think of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and these who were mystics who spent hours in the chapel in peace and in silence. That wasn't her. She was in the midst of this horrible crisis and saw her destruction coming. And it was in that situation that she became a mystic. For us Catholics, I think, the Holy Spirit, we would say this is the Holy Spirit working in her life. Whether or not she knew about it, as from the Catholic point of view, it was the Holy Spirit bringing her closer to God. And the Holy Spirit used the camps of World War II as the fodder that brought her closer to God. Well, I found it interesting that Dr. Berenbaum, who's a professor of Jewish studies at American Jewish University, he read the manuscript and he wrote an endorsement for the back. And he said that he feels that I argued effectively that this is a significant spiritual document, this diary. It's not that well known among either Catholics or Jews, and her story needs to be better known. I think, for Jews, they probably record the fact that she did not become Christian. She was not baptized, or she did not become Christian. But she was very attracted to Christianity and to the contemplative life. But she gave her life for her people. And she's a Jew who didn't believe God died in Auschwitz. Some of the Jewish theologians feel that they don't believe in a personal God anymore, in a loving God anymore. Richard Rubinstein, for example, is an American Jewish theologian. He believes that God died in Auschwitz. He says that nothingness, supreme nothingness, is the creator of the universe. In other words, that the world the creation is an impersonal machine that we're caught up in, rather than that God is a loving God who gives meaning to our lives. What's very important for Etty Hillesum is, in I think it was June of 1942, a report came out on BBC Radio that the report said that some 700,000 people had been massacred the previous year in Poland, somewhere in Poland. That's all they knew on BBC. They didn't have any more specific information. Unfortunately, the newspapers around the world, sometimes buried that information on page 5 or page 6. And anyway, most people read it and didn't believe it, or didn't know what to believe. They just didn't believe this was going on in Germany and in other parts of Europe. But Etty, of course, took note of it, and she was very, very frank that she says, this is probably true. We're all facing this kind of destruction. She said, I have looked our destruction, our miserable end straight in the eye and accepted it into my life, and my love for life has not been diminished. I am not bitter or rebellious or in any way discouraged. I continue to grow from day to day, even with the likelihood of destruction staring me in the face. It's amazing that a 29-year-old young woman, would be so wise about the reality of death and be able to face death. That she knew was coming. She believed it was coming, and of course she was right. Eventually she was put on the train for Auschwitz like everybody else. And then she makes the point that we all have to accept death anyway. Death is coming for everybody. She says, through non-acceptance and through having all these fears, most people are left with just a pitiful and mutilated slice of life, which can hardly be called life at all. She says, it sounds paradoxical, but excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life. And by admitting death into life, we enlarge and enrich it. I mean, what an amazing statement from a 29-year-old lady.